Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Environment Forum at the Mahindra Humanities Center. I'm Ian Miller, co-convener of the forum with Robin Kelsey, professor of photography and dean of arts and humanities here at Harvard. This is the final event of ours for this semester. We'll continue in the spring with a set of exciting events, always exciting events here at the forum, but these are particularly great. I'm excited to welcome these two scholars to campus. The first is a discussion with the historian of science, Deborah Cohen from Yale, recently moved from Barnard, on the uses and abuses of historical thinking in the climate change debate and in the manufacture of climate knowledge. And then second, we'll have a very welcome visit from a familiar figure here at Harvard, the eminent psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, who has turned his gaze from the causes and costs of conflict and violence, issues that he's been dealing with since he was involved in the US occupation of Japan in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, to questions of climate change and environmental damage. It promises to be a terrific lineup for the spring, and it would not be possible, I have to say, I'm very happy to say, without the unwavering support of the Mahindra Center. I'd like to begin by thanking Homi Baba, director of the center, Steve Beal, and Sarah Razor, as well as the full staff at the center. You make all of this possible, you bring all of us together, and it's somehow invisible because you do it so well each and every time. Thank you very much. I'm also grateful to all of you for joining us here at the forum. I'm absolutely delighted with the turnout. I thought it's raining, the climate has impacted our talk about climate. No one's going to show up, and here we are almost overflowing the room. It's just perfect. Thank you for joining us on a cold, rainy night for what promises to be a warm and engaging talk. I'm also grateful I'm pleased to introduce our work in the series, as well as to welcome Professor Michael Pewitt, who will join us for the Q&A following the talk, and who has kindly agreed to introduce tonight's speaker, Prasenjit Duara. Prasenjit joins us from Duke, and he's here to talk about issues related to his most recent book, The Crisis of Global Modernity, Asian Traditions. And I have to shill for the book because it's a wonderful book. Pick it up. It's incredibly provocative and a great read. The Crisis of Global Modernity, Asian Traditions, and a Sustainable Future. Now, to my eye, the purpose of the forum is fairly simple. It's not all that complicated. Our work is, at the end of the day, an effort to situate the humanities and the social sciences in the natural world. I emphasize the preposition because it's meant to carry a double meaning in this case, signaling both the immersion, thank you, I saw that moved, signaling both the immersion of our work as humanists into an encompassing material world, a kind of ecological embeddedness that is sometimes lost in our focus on the realm of ideas and texts. And second, the recognition that work in these fields, from the arts and fiction making to history and the social sciences, offers crucial resources as we struggle to come to terms with the reality of our changing climate and our changing world. Now, it seems that lately, many of us want to see the first of these meanings as more radical, more interesting, more cutting edge. Frankly, to use the term that my graduate advisor used to use, sexier intellectually, right? The material turn and the new materialism seem to be everywhere these days. Ubiquitous phrases used in ways that signal a sea change in how we are trying to think as scholars. I sit on the board for a nationally competitive graduate fellowship down in New York. I go down every year, and as a signal of the kind of durability and applicability and kind of trendiness of this term, it turns out that something like 60% of the finalist applications for the fellowship last year used the term entanglement, meant to signal this embeddedness, this material term. It's become the new buzzword of our age, it seems like. The way discourse was when I was a graduate student in the 1980s. We all read Foucault, we were all engaged in the cultural turn. Now we're turning back to the material world, it seems. It's everywhere in humanistic discourse. We can see that in fairly theoretical or philosophical ways in a growing body of work critical work in particular on ontology, the so-called ontological turn, and in a renewed sense of urgency around more traditional questions such as agency, now distributed in a way it was not in our writing, space and place in a richer ecological sense. In more immediate and apparent efforts, it's there in such efforts as our work on book history here at Harvard. Practiced by Ann Blair, Bob Darnton, Leah Price, and others here on campus, scholarly work has never been immaterial, these folks remind us, not in the ways we like to pretend. They show us that the history of ideas is also a history of technology. In this case, one especially useful, portable, and durable technology, the book. We see it everywhere, and we see op-eds now in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times telling us it won't go away. Now, lately, I sometimes think that the second aspect of our mission, the more commonplace aspect, is more challenging. The material turn is underway. It has momentum, as is evident in the work of those brilliant graduate students who are cranking out grant applications every fall. We see it in our work. We hear it in the questions that come from our students in our classrooms. But what about the uses of the humanistic tradition as we struggle to come to terms with our changing global climate? How can the deep traditions, and I use that word advisedly and technically, the deep traditions, legacies, histories, and cultures enshrined in literate canons from around the world help us to understand and act in this particular moment? How are history and the deep past useful today? How can we write, as Homi said in his eloquent introduction to our forum hosting Naomi Oreskes, how can we learn to write in the first person in specific and personally meaningful ways about forces that so far exceed our individual capacity for representation or even comprehension? Forces and dynamics such as global climate change. What is the role of the humanities and scholars who practice the humanities in such a moment? Few places, perhaps no place, offers a greater depth of intellectual resources defined here as millennia of literate culture, with which to confront these questions than China and East Asia, the locus of this evening's forum. And it's difficult to imagine two scholars who are better suited to usher us into that deep past than Michael Puett and Prasenjit Duara. Michael will introduce Professor Duara and this evening's talk, but I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce him this evening. Michael is Walter C. Klein Professor of Chinese History and Anthropology here at Harvard, and the author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of 4 extremely well-received books, with another quickly on the way. But he's probably best known at Harvard as simply one of the best teachers this school has ever seen. Michael is a genius in the classroom. If you haven't watched him teach, sneak into the back of his lectures. They are fabulous and they're electric, and the reason is sitting right here. This is a professor who asks his students, asks all of us, really, if you read his work, to live as the sages did, to put philosophy into practice, to see how it applies, to understand its contradictions as you think about the choices and values of your everyday life. His intellectual work in that sense defines that aspect of the forum's mission. That is, to summon the deep past, in this case, the Chinese past, the Asian past, into the service of the present, using it to defamiliarize our world and to make new ways of being visible and viable. Please join me in welcoming Michael, and welcome to the forum.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ian, for the much too nice introduction. My deep thanks to you and Professor Kelsey for putting this together. This is such an extraordinary forum, and it's a deep honor for me today to introduce Professor Prasenjit Duara, the first time this year in the session that we'll be bringing in voices from Asia, and as we will see, with a voice that will enable us to do so in truly extraordinary ways. Professor Duara has been for years one of the leading figures, not simply in helping us have a new understanding of Asia, but much more importantly, ultimately allowing us to use the materials, the indigenous concepts in Asia to rethink our most fundamental assumptions, our most fundamental approaches, and rethink what we used to think of as the big questions, now posed in radically different ways. Prasenjit Duara first broke onto the scene with his first book. It was called Culture, Power, and the State. It was an attempt to rethink state formation in China in the first half of the 20th century, but the way he does this is not the way everyone else was doing it, which is, of course, to look at how states operate. He actually begins at the rural level, shows over the course of 50 years the radical transformation in the rural areas affected by the state, and thereby makes an argument how we should understand anew state formation in China, but he makes it very clear this should lead us to rethink state formation in Asia in general and state formation throughout the entire world. In the subsequent decades since the book was published, this has become one of the key works in allowing us to rethink these processes of state formation. Immediately, he moves on to yet another work. This one is called Rescuing History from the Nation, arguing that, yes, most of our historiographies are dominated by accepted notions of the nation state, and many people at the time were saying we should work against this and deconstruct our notions of the nation state. Prasenjit Duara was the leader in saying, absolutely true, but then what do we do next? And the book was an attempt to actively rethink what history would mean if we did not take the nation state as the central focus. Here, too, we have an extraordinarily influential work that has really helped us reconceptualize the practice of history. Following was his third book, Sovereignty and Authenticity, an attempt to rethink our notions of sovereignty, the nation state, in Asia, but again, forcing it onto an international level, and here again, forcing a fundamental rethinking of our assumptions. And most importantly, his latest book, The Crisis of Global Modernity, our discussion for tonight, a truly extraordinary work in which he forces a complete rethinking, not only of the rise of modernity, which is not a minor topic in itself, but even arguing that not just we need to reconceptualize modernity, but how would we redo history so we don't fall into the dangers of assuming a modernity narrative, even as we're trying to deny it. He comes up with a brilliant vision of history as circulation, then rereads the entire so-called modern period through such a history. As he goes, he rethinks our fundamental assumptions about what secularized states are as they arose during this period, rethinking why they arose, what they were really doing, what they were working against, and then perhaps most brilliantly of all, shows how this reconceptualization forces us, or I should even say inspires us, to rethink our notions of the circulation of religions that are ongoing, all of which is then used to make a strong, and I found incredibly powerful and moving argument for how we can reconceptualize the ecological crisis precisely by rethinking our most fundamental assumptions, our most fundamental approaches, and making a sophisticated and brilliant argument for, therefore, what we in the humanities need to do to take part in that effort. We are therefore honored to have Prasenjit Duara here today to bring this brilliance to us as we're all trying to wrestle with these questions. And I therefore ask you to join me in giving our very warmest welcome to Professor Prasenjit Duara. It wasn't that bad, was it? It wasn't that bad.
Well, you may as well just listen to Michael. I mean, you know, I couldn't recognize myself there, but that was fabulous. Thank you very much.
Not at all.
I'm very much humbled now, so please scale down your expectations. I'm very pleased, at any rate, to see all of you here. Every time I've come to Harvard over the last God knows how many years, it's been raining, but people still show up. You know, I don't get rained out at any rate. Now, let's see. I am going to extricate some sacrifices from you because you've taken 15 minutes of my time, and it's a rather long talk. So give me a good. Okay. So yeah, let's see. This way, right? Is it moved? Should have. Yeah. Okay, so the talk is based on the book which you've heard about and which I will plug again at the end, although it's not new anymore. But the crisis of global modernity. But it also deals with some of my recent work that I'm working mostly with Cambodian activists and so on, and also working with my good friends Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, who I'm very pleased to say are here. I was just at Yale last week, or the week before, where we were discussing sort of the methodology of trying to develop a methodology, an agenda of environmental humanities, particularly from the Asian context. Although that will not be the talk here, given what the pre-talks that I've had with several of you, maybe in the discussion we can talk about that. So what is the problem? Can I read this? Okay. So what, as Michael sort of pointed out very, very well, much of the problem has awoken to the climate change issue recently, and I think environmental humanities is, of course, a reaction, a response to that. Can I get a kind of a full screen here? How do I do that? Can somebody help me? Because it's half, and my eyes are not as good as they used to be. Is there? No, I mean, here this screen itself, this laptop is divided into two with my future slide, which I don't need.
Oh, it's in presenter view.
It's in presenter view, so it should be in display settings.
Fortunately, I'm a Mac user, so I'm utterly useless.
Thank you.
Okay. Great, thank you.
You just want yours.
I just want my screen.
No problem at all, sir.
Yeah, I thought it would be
Contingency of
that,
technology.
but I didn't want to mess. Thank you.
There you go. No problem.
Sorry about that. So, so the humanities have sort of responded to it, and we know that the crisis is, well, according to most scientists in the world, is really a product of the overreach, of human overreach, of the modern goal of generating wealth by conquering nature, if one can make a bold statement like that. Even so, many policy makers look to, they look, of course, to renewable energy, which is the one that is most important. That is to say, most policymakers in much of the rest of the world. But also look to geoengineering and market mechanisms to address these problems. Now, to begin with, I'm not opposed. I'm certainly not sympathetic. I think we need all that we can get to address the problems of climate change that we have. But I think that geoengineering and market solutions, market mechanisms, are really have many side problems, including the issues of delivery, of governance, of many plans sort of sit in the drawers of scientists' desks or in the files, I guess. And because of problems of governance, of cultural understanding, of society, and most of course, of political ecology and the politics of these kinds of issues. And of course, many also geoengineering solutions can have all kinds of disastrous side effects that require, once again, civil society and what is now known as citizen science to be able to address. So renewable energy is, of course, great, but I don't think that it can still alleviate our current rate of accelerating climate change and rising ocean levels. I follow closely the ecological economist Tim Jackson, who has a treadmill argument. He is the director of the Sustainable Economy program in the UK and is very involved with the UN as well. And Tim Jackson argues from a kind of a semi-Marxist perspective that as long as we remain on the treadmill of accelerating production, the reduction of polluting energy inputs will simply increase its use for higher production and profits, and at the same time increase the exploitation of other resources. I think one of the best examples in recent times is the rare earth quest, which is really digging very deep in many parts of the world and also producing, of course, abysmal conditions. But it's necessary for your and my cell phones and for everything else that we're doing with contemporary technology. So ultimately, it seems to me that we will need a kind of value change in the world that can limit the mentality of increasing GDP and consumption, that treadmill. At the same time, of course, we need to address the problem of poverty, because after all, we cannot stand up when the third world stands up and says, you know, okay, you've had your goods, what about us, you know? And so I think any notion of environmental justice has to build that in a way that the Paris Climate Conference did not necessarily address. Ecologists and people like Tim Jackson have tried valiantly to show that the problem of alleviation of poverty and the alleviation, or at least addressing mitigation of climate change are not necessarily contradictory, particularly if we are committed, if we do not remain committed to incessant GDP growth as the only measure of prosperity. And you know, they consider many different, how it is that our very notion of prosperity has become reduced to this kind of GDP growth and is only measured in those kinds of terms, which of course in turn involves increasing consumption at a rapid rate and so on. And he talks about, he considers Amartya Sen, who is still at this university, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Could never figure out where he is at any single point. But Amartya Sen's capabilities ideas, which I think are also very interesting, but of course he has to what should I say, adapt them to the conditions of what it means to have a fulfilling life without necessarily going on, by increasing capabilities, but not having sort of access to the full resources of the world all the time. That is with limited thresholds, right? And one of the things that Tim Jackson argues is that, you know, as long as we can, he says that you can have a satisfactory life to fulfill all kinds of purposes with what he calculates a $15,000 per capita income in the world. And if the world could maintain it at that level, you could find many different ways of achieving your capacities and capabilities and fulfilling your desires for many things. It almost sounds like when Marx talks about go fishing in the morning and hunting in the evening and things like that in his communist utopia, but but you may have to do fishing, right? and not go around with your latest gadget. Fly fishing, perhaps, even. So my work is really, now the paper here is designed to probe this problem of value change. And just to, you know, I don't know anything about Costa Rica except what I've given you. I was giving a class lecture and I stumbled onto it. And it seems to me the perfect example, and I'm sure that if there are Latin Americanists here, you will correct me and show me how many problems there are in Costa Rica. But, you know, they have a per capita GDP of 12,000 USD. They have 5% of the world's biodiversity, but the population is 0.06% of the world's population, right? They have 25% of their land is protected, as you can see in this map here, and 50% of the land is forested. It's not, a lot of it is new growth forest, it's not primeval forest or something, but nonetheless they have it. And the Happy Planet Index discovered it to be, rated it as the greenest and happiest country for 3 years in a row in the world. It has displaced Bhutan by far, and also many of the Scandinavian countries in those indices. And and it's not just the Happiness Planet. Gallup poll also found the Central American nation to have the highest level of well-being in the world. So it's not some pie in the sky goal that these guys are talking about. I think you know, a lot has to be done, but it's in the realm of possibility. So what is my argument? I argue that we begin to see the glimmers of value change in a convergence of historical trends, of marginal local communities in Asia and elsewhere in the developing world, seeking to conserve their livelihood resources and coming together with modern groups committed to environmental protection. Right? This convergence, I argue, is a kind of emergent phenomenon in the fashionable sense of the word emergent, of Whitehead and others. But it is, of course, a very weak force. But it is poised, I think, on something very globally significant. They reflect a kind of philosophical attitude that, and the possibilities of a sustainable life in opposition to the neoliberal model that we have lived with now, the neoliberal capitalist, or even what I would say, the national modernization cosmology, focused on the conquest of nature and to feed unending wealth. As I said, it's a weak position. There are lots of weaknesses within this oppositional mosaic, and we can talk about them. I'm not going to dwell on the weaknesses so much this time. I'll mention them. But my goal is really to try and see what this kind of position is. What kind of, is it possible to sort of track it, to trace it, and to view it from world historical patterns that are tied to ideas of transcendence. And my final argument is that I do believe there is a concept, a new concept of sacrality of nature that is beginning to emerge, and that it has social, discursive, as well as some legal underpinnings globally. But you just have to have the right optic to see how it's working. So I really want to draw attention to this possibility in the world. So I go into some depth about some of the theoretical concepts in the book, and that have been very important for me to understand this phenomenon. I use very much, or a version of, it's not the orthodox idea of transcendence that axial age sociologists developed, including our teacher, Ben Schwartz, was a very important part of this. In fact, I first heard about it from him. But I have followed the literature on transcendence. I see it not in the traditional terms of a god or something like that, but really a position of knowledge, what I call a meta-epistemic position of knowledge. I mean, you know, it is something that people have with material consequences. Whether or not that transcendent position is there or not is not significant to me. It works as if it is important for the people who see it, right? But and a lot of philosophers have now been coming around to it. Charles Taylor has become a big advocate. Even Jürgen Habermas, who is of course your ultimate rationalist, post-Marxist rationalist, has come around to this point of view. And he, of course, is super enthusiastic about it. He talks about this is the transcendent position, which is a position from outside the world, really allows you to get a synoptic view of the world as a whole, distinguishing the flood of phenomena from underlying essences. And then he goes on about how you get the difference between health and medicine, law, and this. It's just, I think he overdoes it, but because it's not entirely that. But it is very much the capacity for transcendence. If I had to define it, it's the capacity of abstraction from the here and now, right? So it is the capacity, and it emerges, of course, at the time when you begin to get empires in the 6th century BC that spread across, and that's what the axial axis, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with this, refers to, the axial age across the 6th century onwards, where you have philosophers who posit this meta-epistemic locus. And it does refer to the point at which there is the condition of universalism becomes possible, something beyond the here and now. And it also generates a reflexivity of the self and its position in relation to this world, right? What is my status, what is the meaning of my life in this? How do I relate to it? How do I relate to the world around it? And how do I relate to power, to material power in the here and now? How does this alternative source of moral authority, which is beyond this world, relate to power in the world? So it's a source of ethics and ethical power. And this transcendent role has been completely underestimated in historical studies. And, but if you look at it everywhere, it's everywhere. From the earliest periods, you begin to get establishment institutions, where there's the church and the church-state relations, the mandate of heaven, Brahmin power. These are, of course, become establishment. I mean, the whole idea is that once you have a hold on transcendent power, then political power wants to grab that as well, right? It's always... but then you also have oppositional movements that are based on this, whether this is, the most important is the Protestant movement that we know about, but there are all through history, whether it's Franciscans, Sufis, Buddhists against Brahmins, Buddhist Jains, the Bhakti movement, the Neo-Confucian movement, the Taoists, Thoreau, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. I mean, all these people really work on this alternative source of moral authority, right? And the problem with the Axial Age is that they thought it happened just once, right? But it's a recurrent phenomenon, and in that sense, it becomes a historical process. It's very much part of the historical process. And it's very important for renewal, so social renewal. So, part of the argument in the book is that there is a big difference between transcendence in the Abrahamic societies and in the non-Abrahamic societies, and the book goes on to discuss a great deal of this difference. But I do want to say that what Max Weber called the intellectual religions of the East did not have an omnipotent God in that transcendent position, right? But more rational techniques of cultivation, whether these are ethical, self-cultivation is a big term in Neo-Confucianism, yogic, meditative, in approaching transcendent authority rather than pure faith or just sacralization. So there is a measure of rationality that Weber, of course, always recognized that underlay the sacred authority that was involved in there. So although the major problems of the world manifest themselves, the environmental problems that we have today, locally, and can best be addressed perhaps locally, without a universal vision that the transcendent position gives us, that locus can give us, it becomes a problem of kicking the can down the road, right? It becomes NIMBY. We don't want this chemical factory here, take it somewhere else. That doesn't address that. And this is happening all over the world. Today, Thailand is constructing its most polluting industries in that Burmese strip, which joins it. That's where it does it, because there is no movement in Burma against it in that space. There is on the Maitson Dam and the Irrawaddy River and so on. There's huge civil society movements, but not in that space, and there's nobody there to complain. So what I argue in the book is a position for dialogical transcendence, where you can have this back and forth, which becomes very difficult, much more difficult in the Abrahamic traditions, which has a much purer sense of the transcendent. So one of the principal problems in addressing the universal or planetary dimensions is, of course, nationalism, something I've railed about for about 30 years now, though I've become much more sensible towards it, I think. And the problem of national sovereignty, which prevents collaborative solving of common problems. And I'll just show you one picture of the Himalayan rivers. And it locks national leaders into this whole competitive GDP and resource control game, right? So one of the things, the other thing that I try to do in this book is also talk about how the idea of national sovereignty is so closely tied up with the idea of modern national history, which of course began as national histories. And that it has the role by seeing history as linear and tunneled from origins to destiny, it becomes a means of claiming sovereignty, right? This is our people, our land, our tradition, our cultures, you get out. And besides, you cannot interfere. So it prioritizes national interests way above the planetary interests, right? In a way, the universal transcendence of pre-national religions has been blocked at the nation as the highest level of transcendence and mobilized for tribalist and capitalist competition. I mean, this is my general take on nationalism in general. So what I try to do, as you pointed out, Michael, is that I try to substitute not circulation, but circulatory histories for the linear tunnel histories of nations and civilizations with the idea of circulatory histories. And now I'm developing a paper on it, and one of the common sort of ways in which I thought could be very usable was the Deleuze and Guattari idea of rhizomatics, right, where the same thing can appear in different places simultaneously. But I'm now much more persuaded, although I have to study much more physics for that, to talk about in terms of currents, ocean currents, and the whole sort of ocean physics in a way, and how that also redistributes. And it ties back, of course, to the natural sphere in very interesting kinds of ways. So does the rhizome. But I'm still working on that. So maybe in a year. So what is circulatory history? Events have effects that disperse over space and time, right? A major war can have distant effects on prices or political alliances in third, fourth, 20,000 other places. And I'll just give a personal narrative, not a personal historical narrative, which is the case of the Ahoms. The Ahoms, I come from a part of India called Assam in northeast India. Here you can see that, where is the pointer? Is the pointer working? Do I point here? Yeah, there it is. This is Assam, where you have the Brahmaputra river out here, right? Now, and this is, you can see, it is Yunnan, right? Just around here, Yunnan. The Ahoms came to the Brahmaputra region in the 13th century. They were part of the Dali kingdom or the Dailue kingdom until the 14th century, which was an independent Buddhist kingdom, not controlled by the Chinese empires, until the Mongols come. And then the Mongols overrun it, and the Thais go on. It's not exactly true, but it's pretty close to the truth. Go on to create Thailand, what is now the Thais of Thailand. Whereas one of the very important vassal groups come over, go to the west to the Brahmaputra river, called the Ahoms, and they have very good riverine technologies. And they keep out the Mughals, it's not till the 19th century when the British conquer them that you have it. So they also they Hinduize after a while, they Sanskritize, and they import people from North India. And people of my class background from Assam will say, oh yes, we are from those families. Whether or not we are from there, nonetheless, it is the Mongol invasion that made us who we are there right now, right? So talk about the effects of circulatory histories. Now, of course, and I always take the example of, it's also narratives which change. With the dispersal of the event and the effects of the events, the narratives also change. So, at the time of the 1940s, you had Japanese imperialism, celebrating its great victories, which today is being turned against it very much by those very places where it is, whether it's Taiwanese aboriginals or Koreans or Chinese, and so on. And there may even come a time when, they've resisted it so far, when Japanese school children are reading textbooks about their imperial history that has a very different view from what it was at a certain time. So there is a certain sort of looping back to events and their concatenations with different meanings and endings. So this is the way in which history really circulates, is circulatory, both in, I also give this other example of Marxism coming into China from several different sources, right? Japan, Russia, France, and so on. But when it comes in, of course, the local force transforms it, becomes a peasant revolution, right? Mao Zedong thought. But then, and that goes out then, cycles out to the rest of the world. But what does it become now? Essentially, if you look at what Maoism is today, it is a tribalist movement. You have it among Chiapas, you have it among Central Asians, you have among Central India, in Nepal and these kinds of places. They're essentially tribalist movements. And so you have these kinds of transformations, but the reference is still back to a certain type of Marxism, right? That's going around and shaping societies and reshaping societies. So that's the kind of thing I want to talk about. The important point here is that history is a shared planetary heritage. We need to realize transcendence at a planetary level to match the global nature of human history and the problems humans have created, right? So it's really going to be very difficult to validly depict national histories as the basis of the kind of sovereignty that opposes all kinds of interventions that are necessary. So here, I mean, you know, this has been well studied. The Himalayan rivers, as you know, have produced life for over 1 billion people, 1.5 billion, and many, many species around in the circum-Himalayan region. And what is happening with glacial melting, river diversions, which is happening in China and now also in India, and dam building, most of all, are endangering the sources of livelihoods of these people. And intergovernmental cooperation is absolutely essential. But you find that there are 3 countries in the world in particular who refuse to share information and cooperate internationally on river knowledge and, you know, how much sedimentation is taking place, how much is, you know. And they are, as you would guess, one is China, one is Turkey, and the third is Rwanda. And you know what they all have in common? Any guesses? Rivers originate in those countries. I was saying they're giving this talk and a Tibetan student got up and said, oh, that would be Tibet, wouldn't it? And so there was, yes, I guess if you can make that claim. So this is a huge problem, right? That you cannot find out. It's not easy to have. And the Mekong Commission, which is among the most active, and there's a lot of work on Mekong, both civil society activists and political activists, is been one of the most successful, but still way, way below what should be happening there. So is it possible to elevate sustainability to a transcendent level, right? It seems to me, most people will say, well, it's, you know, corporations and capitalism and so on. Well, certainly that is definitely an issue. But I think the more proximate issue is the problem of national leaders and how they're so tied in to the ideologies of national interests. For example, you had the proposal of Mutsuyoshi Nishimura, who was the first, in the Kyoto Protocol, he was the chief climate negotiator for Japan. And he had a very simple, a very elegant proposal. He said the government should collectively own a capped carbon budget of 660 billion gigatons of CO2 in total emissions between 2010 and 2050. And then he had this idea that these credits will be auctioned off on a polluter pay principle, and those payments will then seek to recover the damages that were caused. And he had all kinds of provisions for handicap provisions for developing societies and so on. And it was something that certainly the NGOs, who have been among the main forces behind all these climate change talks, had agreed on. And they had a principal agreement on this kind of thing. But it was always the national governments that would claim national mitigation circumstances and so on. And for a long time, it was China and the US, you know, the US saying you're polluting totally much more, and the China was saying, well, you've done it historically per capita, you're so much more, and so on. Then finally, we get to some kind of first step with the Paris 2015 UN Climate Change Conference, what is known as COP21. And that was a huge moment of celebration, although it was just a first stage because it was all voluntary and it didn't have anything to do with your capacities to implement any of this. And then we come to a stage now when that's off the table with the US, right? So, and we have to see now so it's always, many steps backwards at every point. So, although, as I said, government and intergovernment agencies are officially behind this effort, it is really global civil society that is the main pressure group behind them. NGOs, quasi-government agencies like IPCC and things like that, private-public initiatives, all of these have been very important in this whole movement in the world. And not least among these is the transformation of religious societies in the world. Now, of course, the Pope has gotten very big into it, but until recently it was many Asian societies which had Asian religious group which embed dialogical but authoritative realm for self-formation and value renewal, right? So what I want to discuss is the tendency towards the converging goals for both religious and non-religious social groups, civil societies, linked by this idea of ecological spirituality, which I'm going to talk about now. First, let me talk a little bit about cultural circulations in the Anthropocene. So it's part of the circulatory history moment, right? One of the examples I give in my book that people seem to enjoy much is the idea of Ram Mohan Roy, who is often considered the father of modern India. In 1831, he was in Bristol. He was a he was a Vedantist, but he saw an equation between the Vedanta and Unitarianism, and he was in Bristol, and I found this letter circulating in Peabody, in the Peabody archive, in the Salem archive, that has this little fragment that Ram Mohan Roy will come to Salem, and so we are circulating this lock of hair of his, so in order to sort of celebrate his saintliness and things like that. And he couldn't come because he dies just then in 1831. And so, but then apparently that opened up a whole archive which showed how Thoreau and Emerson had read some of his translations. There were other translations also, but had read some of his stuff and were preparing to sort of, and this led very much to the kind of Thoreauvian transcendentalism, right? Which in turn, and civil disobedience, which in turn influences someone like Gandhi. Although Gandhi doesn't fully admit it, but through Tolstoy, it influences Gandhi. And Gandhi then, of course, influences Martin Luther King, right? So you get this sort of looping back and forth the whole time, which is part of this cultural circulations, right, of what we can call spirituality, right? So they have typically been thought of as countercultural movements among hippies or urban groups or rural reconstructions in East Asia. I think they're very important, and in the Trans-Pacific. But I think they're developing a new relevance as their causes become tied to the most marginal groups in Asian societies, and I would say in Latin American societies and African societies to a lesser extent as well. So on the one hand, you have American spiritualist movements that embrace a holistic view of nature, from Thoreau to deep ecologists to world wildlife to all of these kinds of agencies, both I would say on the extreme wilderness side, but also the corporatist types like Conservation International and so on, who I think also have some very interesting ideas. So but they are forging linkages with groups that are developing around Gandhian ideas, around Buddhist forest monks, among Taoist temples and others as well. So at first glance, this seemed like little rivulets that are going around. But I think one of the things that is really transforming them is this hyperconnectedness of our age, right? And I'll talk a little bit about how this kind of the new civil society, that is the new media civil society, which also has such destructive effects, can also create new types of allegiances and alliances that give it a certain flexibility and resilience, I think. You can just look at Hong Kong, the way it's been resilient. what they do is these different types of movements that are converging, I think they converge upon a non-binary philosophical attitude with consequences not only for lifestyle changes, but for the ecological future of the planet. As I keep saying, it is a very weak force, but a very resilient form of politics that networks across the global space of the new media to achieve some of its goals. I'll give you some examples of that. First, just a little explanation on the term spirituality. The way I define spirituality, also taken in collaboration with Peter van der Veer and others, is that really it is a residual realm for the transcendent that emerges with the global trend towards secularization, privatization of religion, the deinstitutionalization, and particularly the laicization, especially in Europe, that happens here, which is, I think, at the root of the green movement and so on as well. Modern spirituality as such is a new sphere in historical society, which is derided as dreamy but important repository. And we know that it was, in the West, it was started very much with the Unitarians, the Theosophists, New Age spirituality, and so on. And as I've discussed, in North America, ecological spirituality, Thoreau's insights were carried particularly by people like John Muir, Aldo Leopold, of course Rachel Carson's and all those people, Arne Naess, and today has emerged as a significant American environmental movement, although it has many different branches. And you already begin to see the hookup with Asian environmentalist thought and or proto-environmentalist thought with American Buddhists and others, right? Like Gary Snyder, Alan Watts, and others. Today, modern associational groups and circles have also grown in Asia, Latin America, and Africa who seek to protect the environment and join with the people who are really most immediately and most powerfully affected by climate change. That is, marginal indigenous traditional communities who have been bearing the brunt of the ecological devastation of their world. These marginal communities often tend to view nature as sacred, though not necessarily, we shouldn't romanticize them, but they often need to view it as sacred in order to preserve what they have, the little that they have. And they often use and they employ the sacrality to protect it. You know, if you look at tree-hugging movements and so on, these have very much to do with their local notions of what nature is about. And you know, the biggest environmental movement in India took off with the Chipko movement, which is a tree-hugging movement of 1972, right? And spawned a huge movement from there. Note also, I mean, this kind of alliance is not just happening in the developing world. And I will give you an example of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which could have had a huge impact. You know, until I think it was January, the Army Reserve Corps of Engineers had agreed that this will not take place in this Dakota country, right? And it was only with the new president, with our unnamed president, who where this was reversed. So if it had been pursued, you know, it could have had a rolling effect. I think it's set back now. I don't think it's going to disappear, but you did have a lot of people mobilize around it. And there's a lot of indigenous symbolism and sort of nature, sacrality and so on going on here as well. Now, within the Asian traditions, we have theologically in Indic, Chinese and indigenous peoples' cosmology, the sacredness of nature is of course a byproduct of a perspective integrating social, moral and natural order, what in Chinese is known as Tianren Heyi, the organic unity. And you know, this is of course now something that was forgotten for the last 100 years, but is coming back in a big way, not least due to some of Professor Pewett's efforts, I'm sure, since he has such an impact on the most impactful classes in the US. But also I should say that John and Mary Evelyn have left, but the whole study of religion and environment begins at Harvard with Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, who produced 10 volumes of world religions and the environment, right? In the 90s, I think it was. So they were really ahead of their time in many ways. What draws these diverse currents and phenomena is their anti-dualism, the idea that you cannot have an integrated and organic view, cannot operate on the assumption that humans and nature are a binary, that humans can in fact conquer nature as something and rather see nature as very much part of yourself. I'm sure you've heard a lot about this in your discussions here before, so I won't bore you with those details. But I do have lots of examples here, which I don't think we need to go into since time is short. But one of the very important activists in all these in Asian religions are in fact the Thai, Cambodian, Laotian Buddhist monks. These are forest monks who have, and I'm spending a lot of time with the Cambodian monks and the local communities who have now sort of taken over from the monks. But the monks are also still very important as they have this ceremony of ordinating trees, right? And this ceremonial robing of trees and so on, which and have unleashed a very powerful movement against deforestation and dam building in those regions. And the Thai Buddhist monk Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, of course, puts it very simply. He says, once the way he relates it is that one's realization of the interconnectedness of all things and life forms, which are transient and changeable, will help deflate one's ego, knowing that everyone is one and the same, being subject to the same natural laws. His spirituality rejected specific religious identification. So he was very much the spirituality mode, this so non-institutionalized religion, this deinstitutionalized notion of something spiritual. And he was one of the most important, I think, inspirations for the forest monk environmental movements. The other place that this is very important is Taiwan. Taiwan has one of the most dynamic civil societies in Asia today. And within that, the Buddhist groups are very powerful. You've all heard of Tzu Chi, but there's Fagu, there is Fo Guang Shan, there are many others. And all of them have as one of their central planks, the central plank in most, Huan Bao, which is protect the environment. And you may have individual critiques of what they do or what they don't, and how much they give in and how much they don't. But there are also some very powerful thinkers among some of these. I have worked on one or two of them as well. Anyway, there's a lot more here. I don't think we need to go into all of this. But I do want to sort of try and see how we can understand the relationship of these religions to this, what is ultimately a new project, right? The environmental protection. You can't say that Taoism is interested in nature, therefore it's a smooth, continuous flow. So we really have to change our notion of historical understanding. It's not one of substantial transition from the substance of one thing to a substance of another. It's, if we look at it from the philosophical idea of emergence, then you know that when a historical event or process impacts a social formation, it affects an emergence which combines both the prevailing factor and the new thing. But the interesting historical problem is that the new phenomenon seeks to justify itself only in terms of the old, right? So this is the narrative challenging, as it were, the circulation, right? And I think that we've had, all of deconstruction has been based on this separation, right? Your claim. And I think we should really go beyond that and recognize with people like Paul Ricoeur and so on that the important thing is the pertinence. If these people feel impelled to do something that is a good cause, right, and they connect it with something that they can see was there, then that's good enough, right? What is the pertinence? And does the pertinence have persuasive power, right? So I think this is something very important that, and here I just want to talk about, and I'm also indebted once again to Mary Evelyn for this. Pope Francis's June 2015 encyclical on care for our common home. This is a very radical document and likely to have a huge impact because it's going to be taught in all the Catholic schools all around the world, and which integrates ecology and justice. And it's very radical because popes earlier had made kind of environmental noises earlier, but they stayed within the framework of the stewardship argument. Now, those of you who are in environmental humanities will be familiar with Lynn White's critique of Christianity as something that sees nature as something given by God to humans to do whatever you like with it, right, for your bounty. And the response of the church to that kind of critique is that, well, God gave it to humans to be a steward of, to steward it, right? So there's still a duality, but it's one of care. And what this Pope does is that he does refer, for various reasons, to many earlier Pope statements and things that, but he's changing the underlying argument. It's not about stewardship or anything. It is tied very much on a very different concept of what is the divine will, right? It's talking about, he invokes Mother Earth, he invokes Francis of Assisi, and he really refers to integral ecology, connecting humans to the environment and to the evolutionary process, right? So he's making these radical changes framed within, of course, a hermeneutic tradition, which he has to. So, but it really gives you the sense of the pertinence. Is it pertinent or not? How is it going to be accepted? And how long? We don't know how long this Pope will last, but you know, there are many forces working against him. But I think he's turning out to be one of the most interesting figures of our time. Of course, we've talked also about India and the Hindu groups that are fashioning themselves also in this response. Of course, here there's a problem that you get Hindutva also mixed in with the Hindu naturalism and so on. But those are one of the problems that we also. I talked about Taiwan. So these religious groups in Asia may be particularly suited to mediate between precarious local communities and this transcendence of sustainability. In many parts of Asia, communities are resisting efforts to exploit or industrialize their natural resources by appealing to the sacrality of commons, right? Taoism, animism, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism are utilized to protect resources by using terminology in China of Xiangtu, right? These are sort of sacred homelands, sacred groves. The whole segments of Yunnan are now considered to be sacred forests of marginal peoples and so on. Community forests, holy waters, especially in India, to oppose local environmental pollution. Now, apparently, talking about the environment, the legal underpinnings, the Ganges, polluted as it is, one of the most polluted rivers probably in the world, it's now considered to be a crime, a legal crime, to pollute. What is it called? The Ganges is considered to be the equivalent of a person, has the rights of a person. So you can be charged for killing it. Right? So you can get that kind of sentence. And this, of course, in Latin America, you have a lot of these kind of things for trees and so on. So I think there is a kind of legal underpinning to this idea of the sacrality of natural creatures, I should say. And I've talked about several of these. Here is a conference I did in just 2 or 3 months ago in Phnom Penh, and where it was really exciting because you could see, although it was started by these Prelang group, Prelang, and there are 2 or 3 different forests, Priya Vihar, Prelang. These were forest dwellers, semi sort of Cambodian and semi-tribal. They were Hindu Buddhist, and they took on the movement, and once they started taking on the movement, the Buddhists joined them, and then local civil society joined them, and it became so prominent that, you know, it got the attention of global media. And suddenly it became a place where, you know, all levels of civil society began to enter there. So they were always set up, very articulate, you know. At this particular, this monk to your right. By the way, he's in, I have his name, Venerable Ben Salut, I think. He's at UVA, very articulate. He spent a lot of time in India, so he speaks English. And he's very interesting. The other guy is probably, but he's, you know, he says, I talk to Hun Sen all the time. So you don't want to go too close to a person like that. But the other guy doesn't speak English, but he seems to be much more with much greater integrity, at any rate. He won't talk to Hun Sen. Here are some of their pictures. This is also from the cover of my book. This is this group that has been demonstrating since, I think, long before 2010, but they came to attention in 2011. What they're doing, they call themselves Cambodia's avatars. And for them, avatar has a meaning in the Hindu-Buddhist tradition. And what they did is they began to lead weekly demonstrations in the main square in Phnom Penh, where they would engage in their own forms of ritual theaters of protest, right? So it would be something, it would be ritualized, it would be theatrical, but it was a petition. It was their form of protest. And it attracted so much attention, and they took on the name Avatar, but not because of their local meaning, but because the movie. So they're depicting themselves as this creature below, right? So that is what this whole thing is all about. So, but that's a very interesting aspect of circulatory history, where it comes back again to you, but via the global media, right? And they got huge global attention on this. And I think there are several groups that are studying the impact of Avatar. I don't know if they've started studying these. I don't think those two have been joined. It's a good cultural studies project. I met several of these people. This is dam activism. This is the Chipko movement, the tree hugging movement that set off the whole environmental movement in India. Now, people say that in China the environment is such bad shape, and most of the attention now is being placed on the government's efforts. And certainly there has been a great deal of government effort recently, but mostly in the realm of renewable energy, and mostly in response to middle-class urban Chinese, right? So if you know the movie, Chai Jing's movie, Under the Dome, which I should have included a discussion of it, but it's a very interesting movie, very powerful about how you cannot breathe in Beijing. Now you can't breathe in Delhi. But and they did manage to clear that, but how? I mean, it was very much a middle-class movie, a middle-class urban movie. And the whole rural areas continue to be very much kicking the can down the road, right? So you need a much greater kind of effort. And of course, in China, we know that the principal problem has to do with the mixed messages. So the center, grandpa, always says good things and even abolishes your taxes. But then the local government has to then pick up the flag, right? Or pick up whatever you have to pick up. And they have profit motives, right? They have production targets and so on. So that's always a kind of tension. But nonetheless, environmental NGOs have grown by leaps and bounds in China. They have become, I don't know if I have it here. I'll just come back to that. I have to show you that. The numbers. In 2008, there were 2,768 environmental NGOs. And by 2013, this had gone up to 8,000. This is one area of civil society, the green public sphere, which is permitted in China to some extent. And the reason it is permitted is because, in a way, they act as watchdogs. They are not activists so much as protectionists, right? They're watchdogs because the laws are all on the books. The laws are there, but it's really the implementation. So between the media and the ENGOs, you begin to get 5 minutes more. You begin to get some kind of legal results as well. But it's a mixed story, of course, as you'd expect. I'll just go back to this Taoism. Now, talking about pertinence and Taoism, let me just. This is the Taoists in China in the post-Kaifang, the post-opening years, have been much less successful in gaining attention than the Buddhists or the Confucianists, right? And there's no sort of natural global constituency for them. Natural is important. And so when this alliance of religions and conservations approached them, this is, by the way, this is an alliance that's based in Bath in England, and it's been very very big, and it really begins to try and link up traditional religions with conservation efforts. They agreed to join with them, and they declared Lao Tzu to be the Pao Hu Sheng Tai Shen, right? So Lao Tzu has become the protector god of the environment, right? This is what he's become. He's officially stated as that. And when you go, and although they don't have huge popular followings, they control all the Taoist temples in China. I just went to Maoshan last summer, and they control the temples, and they are beautifully kept now. And you're not allowed to burn more than 3 sticks of incense. You have to recycle. You have to use these, what do you call them? These photovoltaic, these, what are they called? Anyway, solar energy and things like that. And they have strict rules of all of these things. So at some level it's working, and it is having a kind of an impact, It's part of the public sphere here. And here is I love this flag of theirs, which is yin yang and green, right? The greening of Taoism. And then people have found all kinds of things that have survived the Chinese Revolution and the Cultural Revolution, like these feng shui forests. All over, there's huge forest coverage. And feng shui, people are just beginning to get into it, because feng shui is just seen as some kind of modern urban fad, right? But in fact, it's the Tianren He, very much at the core of it is this idea of the organic nature of human and natural prosperity, that the two cannot be separated. So you have Chris Coggins is doing very good work on this with his whole team in China. And the Chinese local governments, several local governments have become involved in this as well. There's one thing that more I want to talk about, the Chinese green public sphere, on the global green public sphere, and the relationship between these popular and whether or not religious movements and global civil society. I'll give you just one example. In the mid-1990s, in the early 1990s, when the Three Gorges Dam was being set up, was being planned, and the construction had begun, the surveying had taken place, and so on. And the Chinese government had gotten billions of dollars of funding from not just the Western governments, not just IMF and World Bank, but also Morgan Stanley and other investment banks and so on. And there were, of course, murmurs of protest from local scientists and so on, but no fuss was made, until Dai Qing wrote the book Yangtze Yangtze, which got translated immediately. And by 1999, when the Chinese government went for the second tranche of its billions of dollars, none of these governments, not the IMF, not the World Bank, not even Morgan Stanley gave it the money, because it had been lobbied by environmental groups. Its shareholders had been lobbied, right, and told to avoid this kind of thing. So, I mean, you can see how a small little stir can make a huge global scale sort of activism. So it became much more expensive for the Chinese government. And it's still a very dicey project. They claim that the 2008 earthquake, as you've heard, was a consequence of the settling of the reservoir, the final reservoir. And apparently, Po Xilai was telling people, if you really go after me, I'll tell the world how many people are still being resettled from the Ganges, from the Yangtze Valley, and so on. Apparently, that didn't happen. So, and this is happening all over, certainly all over Southeast Asia and the Mekong Delta. You know about Maizon, the Burmese Irrawaddy thing that was cancelled in 2011, and so on. And Yunnan, of course, is the great cradle of all of these movements. And the Yunnan-Southeast Asian connection is very interesting as a transnational area of activism. So, my final, I hope. Yeah. So I think so you have these two different notions of sacrality that are beginning to sort of come together in an unstable kind of way. One is the sort of religious and, well, actually two. One is the religious, the other is local communities, marginal communities, who have a certain conception of nature around them. But the other is the modern sector of civil society and civic activism, which also includes a lot of scientists. And this is happening through the idea of modern protection. And the best example of this, of course, is the United Nations Common Heritage of Humankind, the protected regions, right? Legally, there are 160,000 legally protected areas in the world, nationally and internationally, including about 1,000 World Heritage sites, which are both cultural and natural. More of them are about biodiversity. And it covers 12% of the land area of the world. By the way, this doesn't include the oceans, where most of a lot of the strangling is taking place. And some studies have shown that they have reduced rates of deforestation, protected species, and conserved land and water. I like to call this a kind of a modern sacrality, because after all, what is involved here? It's an inviolability, right? When you protect an area, you're saying it's inviolable. And why is it inviolable? Because it arises from the elemental urge to protect the sources of life, which is, after all, what also religious sacrality is often related to. So they are at least partially the legacy of ecological spirituality and ecological activism. National and global legal institutions are beginning to recognize these demands, and we have examples of the Indian Supreme Court, who declared that the Orissa Konds, where in fact the most bauxite mining in the world takes place, is declared the sacred site of the Konds, and so no more mining can happen there. This has, of course, other types of problems, but it's a very interesting development, and there was a rash of other legal protections then that came about at that point, especially with marginal groups, with tribal communities and so on. Yunnan also has the sacred sites and the history of that is very interesting. We don't have time to go into it. The 3 parallel rivers of Yunnan protected areas, where activists like Pei Shengji, Yu Xiaokang, and so on have created the whole notion of sacred forests and so on. So, okay, I don't think I think my conclusions are pretty evident from my talk. So I'll just stop here.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I'll leave you with this world map with total percentage of each country under natural protection. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And,
sorry, it took a long time. Huh?
Oh, well, it's important material. And
is this my glass? I have one, so it might be yours.
Yes,
sorry.
yes.
Okay.
So we are on a truncated schedule for complicated reasons having to do with room booking and so on, far more detail than you all need. But we will be on coming to a rather abrupt end. We'll need to vacate the room in about 20 minutes. So in order to move with alacrity into the Q&A, I'd like to introduce Michael and ask Michael to begin the discussion. Then after that, we'll open to the floor to questions and comments such as time allows and come to light. Without further ado, Michael.
Wonderful. I will be very brief because I do want to open things up for discussion, but let me just say thank you. That was extraordinary. It was both extraordinary in terms of all of your work, just breathtaking in its reconceptualization of world history and just the amount of material you bring in. But thank you for another reason too, because it's also equally true of all of your work, but now with such an important implication, it's really inspiring. I mean, it's one of the few talks I think I've ever heard on the crisis where you come away thinking there is hope. And not just because...
I'm always in. The cup is always half full for me.
And not just in a rah-rah sense, we can really do this. I mean, with a real sense of, no. I mean, there actually are movements going on. There really are possibilities. And what seems at the moment like a completely overwhelming danger facing us, your argument is, no, that's part and parcel of the dangerous ways we are conceptualizing it, and the dangerous ways we're conceptualizing it are part and parcel of what is going on. And if we actually alter all of this, it opens up everything. So thank you. Thank you for both the brilliant reconceptualization and the feeling, convincingly so, of these possibilities that are truly emergent.
Happening. There are really things happening.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much for the, I have many questions. I'd love to ask about Shinto, for example, but we'll have other opportunities for that. What I'd like to do in order to recognize all of you who have come is open the floor to questions, and please raise your hand and let us know who you are as we move ahead. Let's come right back here. And
I'm Catherine Arrett. I'm a resident of Cambridge and have been to China many times.
Yeah.
Often in the United States, when we have a an environmental issue that has been caused probably maybe by manufacturing and other things. The push back and forth is not only for the environment, but people say, well, what about the economic improvement of the people that are benefiting by whatever this development is? So how do you tie the two things together, the environmental protection versus the movement forward to people to bettering their economic standing?
Should I answer now or take it?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yes.
Well, I did try to address it in Tim Jackson's view, but of course that's not an immediate view. That's the long-term view, and I don't have a program for action here. I do have a scholarly view that in the agenda of environmental humanities, what I argue is that we should still be looking into issues, the traditional pillars and categories of environmental of studies is adaptation, mitigation, political ecology, and so on, to show who gains and who benefits by certain environmental moves, and how the poor are often left out of that, right? So to some extent you can address it through an ecologically informed economic study, right, to address the questions of poverty. Of course, there are, policy people who say that you can just do what the Chinese are doing. Well, the positive side of what the Chinese are doing is just build a lot of renewable energy structures and so on that will generate employment and so on too. But ultimately, I think we have to move to the Tim Jackson argument, which is that we have to get rid of the idea that wealth and economics is related only to greater and greater production, that there has to be a diversity of goals and values of what we think of as prosperity, right, including the ways you use your time, the kinds of activities you do with that, so on. So I have a three-pronged answer. I don't know if it's satisfactory. Yeah, I think Bill had a question.
Yeah, so we'll come here.
Well, Prasenjit, thank you for a wonderful talk and for a wonderful book.
Thank you.
And it's just wonderful to have even a iota of optimism in the world on these issues, on
Quite
almost
apart
any
from
issue.
half the cup.
But on the China front, I guess I want to press you just a little bit more, because I think Taiwan is an example of what can happen, obviously, in a Chinese cultural area. There are a variety and extraordinary, Tzu and other organizations have been extraordinarily helpful. Having an opposition party that is a green party also has something to do with it. But it's in our own lifetime, since the time when you and I as graduate students were in Taiwan, we've seen the physical transformation of this landscape.
Absolutely.
On the mainland, by contrast, you have obviously things in a quite different way. But the area, if I were to think of where I would be optimistic of where that would head, it's actually, sadly, not because of civil society or because of local activists in Yunnan, or it'd be because of the kind of relentless engineering on top. The guy who really turned the Ministry of Engineering, of Environmental Protection around, Chen Jining, former president of Tsinghua. You now have a relentless crackdown on coal-fired power plants and so on, all across the country in terms of production. One size fits all. Yeah. And my guess is that this is going to the degree that this happens, it will make a dent and a difference faster almost than anything else. But the civil society part, which is the truly optimistic one of this as a global movement, how do you see this in a world governed by Xi Jinping Sixiang, and in a world in which civil society, and particularly religiously affiliated civil society, is under such pressure? Last thing I'll say, I remember when he came to power, a friend of mine, a Buddhist, said to me, don't worry about Xi Jinping. He's secretly a Buddhist. He's going to bring the Dalai Lama back. So give me some hope on that front.
Well, I think that we are not yet in a position to say that civil society will develop, will flourish in China or something, but I think it does play a role. And while there is a huge crackdown as well under Xi Jinping, I'm not sure it is happening so much in the environmental area. I haven't followed the contemporary scene that much. But certainly there's still all kinds of protests that are going on. I mean, not environmentally related, but land related. And I think that is an important dimension of it. Because when you control the land, I mean, you can sell it off or something, but right now, with the property situation, people still have, in most parts of China, a share to the land, and they're recognizing that they cannot let that go easily, right? In some parts of South China, they're being transformed into cities and so on, or whatever, these semi-urban residential things. But I think there are forces in society, not civil society forces, but forces in society that have not angled it necessarily in an environmental direction, but in a land direction, which I think is an important component. So that's the very long and slow, but you're absolutely right. This is the biggest challenge. And I do think, and Xi Jinping is working on the gamble, on the bet, the wager, that just having a lot of renewable energy will do a lot of good stuff, and a lot of geoengineering technical stuff that they're doing as well, and with rivers and so on, though I think that is going to be another disaster. These are these big projects. So I think it really is also a rural-urban. It's becoming increasingly not only East Coastal thing, but a rural-urban thing, where you can see contamination, where you cannot, right? This is a global problem, but it's even bigger in China because it's that much more difficult to see in those places. So, but I don't have a good answer. You're right. That is a global weakness at this point. Though I'd be interested in other views, if people are more optimistic about Xi's top-down approach.
So I have a question here. I have a number of questions, and we'll move through. Robin will be next on the.
Okay.
No. Oh, okay. The mic, so the baton.
So I'm disheartened as someone who spent half his professional life in energy efficiency and the other half in renewable energy, and have a deep.
I'm sorry, you are, sir?
I'm George Wood.
Okay.
And a deep, abiding commitment to the environment. Yeah. I still, and know the results in New England and the US of these efforts, and the huge mountain that we have to climb in this country, in New England. I've sought, and your talk speaks to me to something that's much bigger and more powerful, and that is to connect with people's spiritual belief. And having read the encyclical 3 times. And,
oh, you have.
And he speaks both to the anger that a lot of us feel in the environmental movement, to the hope, but also to something you spoke of in your speech, and that is the divine.
Divine, yeah.
And for me, and I would love to hear your thoughts, how do you, has a much bigger global view than I do, I'm rather New Englandish, how
New
do
England
we,
is the world.
how do we, as people, and get more people like the Pope to proselytize about the divinity in nature, and I think change from within, right? The spirit, and I think that's part of what you're speaking to. Sure. But that, to me, I know all the technical solutions. I see the actual practical picture, but I think the real movement is what you're speaking to, and that's to connect with the divine.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't think I mentioned this. Precisely at the time when we were in Cambodia doing this, or maybe a little earlier, there was an event in Oslo, which I went to last month. They gave me an honorary doctorate. But which was a very interesting event. And the people in Cambodia alerted me to it. It was an interfaith rainforest movement event. So the Pope sent his representative, direct representative, people from all many African, Latin American, Asian societies, as well as, of course, Europeans and Americans, attended that. It was a huge event, supported by the Rainforest Initiative in Oslo. By the way, Norway is spending more money than any other for global ecological. I mean, they also dig out the most oil. So, I mean, you know, there's but they're also into renewable energy. But they're spending it at least, right? And this was a very important one, because the statement of it says that rainforests are the principal carbon sinks in the world. And the indigenous people who inhabit those areas are the ones who are suffering most. And it is the duty of the world, the religions of the world, to protect those areas. And it even mentions, you know, who are the ones who are devastating it. Not personally, but industries. So I thought it was, and the Pope had a very important representative. The Dalai Lama sent his. There were many Chinese groups, Buddhist groups. There were many Hindu groups. There were many Muslim groups as well. You know, if you're interested, I can send you the link. There's a huge sort of reports on it, and they are now going ahead. I don't know their program of action, but it's been set up, and it's a recognition. Again, like COP21, it's a kind of a landmark, I think, in many ways, for this kind of change, as the spiritual attention to it. Let's see what happens. There are always many good developments that we can feel optimistic about.
So I'd like to come up here, and we'll begin with the young woman, and then, given time, we'll move down the line.
So thank you for your wonderful talk. So, but I'm.
What's your name?
Oh, sorry. So I'm Zheng Wu from Boston University. I'm from China. So it's interesting to see that you connect this ecological thinking or movement to Taoism or Confucianism, but it's a little bit awkward for me to say that this ecological thinking is kind of spiritual or religion, because you know China is kind of secular society, right? Because of communism. So, and because I grew up in China, so it took me some time to understand what is religion when I came to the US. And according to my understanding, so transcendence or sacred, right, is much about the afterlife or another world, which is not this current world, right? So, but you know, this ecological thinking or movement concerns very much about the current world. Yeah. And the thing is that I wonder whether we can argue things on the other way around, is that instead of the sacred, to make this the ecological thinking as a religion, right? I wonder it is a secularly usage of religion in our secular life, right? That actually make more sense for me instead of making it as a spirituality or religion. And yeah, so that also bring me about your interpretation about the word 乡土. So the interpretation of the word 乡土 is more as homeland, right? And then so I don't understand why you translate it as sacred land.
No, I didn't translate it as sacred land. I mean, I added that as another category. It was not a translation. So Xiangtu is, for instance, it's the you know, very interestingly, as Bill knows very well, the most important pre-war environmental regimes were the Nazis, right? At least in the early phases. And the most important concept for their environmentalism and for their political ideology was Heimat, and which is homeland, which is what Xiangtu is. I mean, the Japanese Kyoto, Chinese Xiangtu is really using this German concept with all its metaphysical and originary dimensions. Of course, changed as it circulates in different parts. But in Yunnan, this thing has started again, Xiangtu. And that is to say, these environmental groups in Yunnan are saying that children who get environmental education in the school are just, they're not interested. It's just something they have to do. Whereas if you involve them in their local communities, in their Xiangtu, and get them to see invasive species and which invasive species are bad, this, that, have them do projects outside and so on, it has much greater effect. It affects them spiritually as well, right? So in that sense. Now to come back to your first part of your question, which is that you're saying that it's more that religion is being instrumentalized, used instrumentally. I would rather not think of it that way. I think the concept that I want to use is really pertinence, right? This is the idea I was trying to develop. What is the pertinence between something that may have had other motives but had those qualities, and what is the new project? So I would rather not instrumentalize it because it has many creative possibilities. It's not just being used for that one instrumental purpose, right? So
we cannot transcend time and the clock, and I am deeply,
we are in linear
deeply
time.
sorry, but so grateful for a rich talk that has filled our time and filled our evening.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.